Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 172 of the podcast. This is the second in kind of a series on the podcast, which is something we've never done before, but it all ties in with a live online event that we did with Ministry Boost back in the summer called Volunteer Boot Camp. And we talked all about recruiting, onboarding, encouraging, training, empowering, and retaining volunteers with guest speakers. And during the event, we took some questions, but we didn't get to them all. So this episode and the other episodes in this series, this is the second one, are a chance for us to go back and ask the questions to those speakers that we didn't get to on the call. So today we have Conley, and Kenny talked about onboarding volunteers in the Volunteer Boot Camp, talked about his system for that, some great things there. We're going to play a snippet from what he taught here in this episode, but you're going to go check out the whole thing if you didn't watch Volunteer Boot Camp live, and you can get that in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 172. But let's go ahead now and listen to that snippet of Kenny teaching about onboarding volunteers, and then we'll jump into me asking Kenny the questions we didn't get to during the live event.
So how you recruit impacts your volunteer conversion rate, but also I believe is your volunteer onboarding process has a significant impact on how you convert potential volunteers to actual volunteers. And over the last 3 or 4 years since moving here to Mission, I've really been tweaking and manipulating how we do volunteer onboarding. And we found over the last 2 to 3 years measurably that we have about 85 to 90% of people who raise their hand that say they want to volunteer actually become volunteers. And it's primarily because of what we've done in our volunteer onboarding process. And so I'm going to share a free gift with all you guys today. A year ago, I wrote a course, a Ministry Boost course called the Volunteer Pipeline. And it's essentially how we do volunteer onboarding here at Mission. And it's all the resources and everything. It's turnkey. You can just use it and begin to implement it at your church, or you can modify it however you need. And so that's a really big thing. But just 2 weeks ago, I created a quick little PDF called 5 Hacks to Volunteer Onboarding. And it's a great little resource to help you unpack a couple little hacks and tweaks that you can maybe adjust to your own process that's going to definitely help you get more volunteers through your process. And so I'm going to share that with all of you. We'll send it out as an email after the webinar so you can all get that. And today, right now, I'm going to share with you 3 of those hacks, okay? 3 of those hacks really quick. It should be really simple, just little things, and I'm going to unpack them for you. So you'll see these in the PDF that you get later, but I'm going to unpack these 3 just a little bit more. The first hack is this: is stop recruiting volunteers, okay? Now, I know that sounds like, like against what we're trying to do, but here's the thing that I think is worth considering. Recruiting volunteers to serve in your ministry, I think, is one of the hardest things that we have to do as ministry leaders. Now, some of you are wired like you are salespeople. Like you could sell anything to anyone, and you're an amazing volunteer recruiter. But that's not everyone. That's not how everyone is wired. And recruiting somebody to volunteer is really hard because people immediately in the back of their head, they're thinking of all the reasons why they shouldn't volunteer or why they can't volunteer or what might come up and prevent them from volunteering. And so when you are trying to recruit somebody to volunteer, like you're coming against all the things that are already going on in the back of their mind, and it's a really hard sell. And so here's the idea. I don't think we should completely stop that, but I don't think that should be our primary way. I think there's actually something better we can do. And if you actually go back, you look at history, you look at the history of warfare and battles. But one of the things that was just as important, if not more important, than like the strategy that you used in a battle or even the number of troops that you used in a battle is actually the location. Okay, where you fought the battle, like was it on high ground? Was it what kind of protection did you have? And so the idea behind really recruiting volunteers in a great way is actually changing the location. For us, we have stopped recruiting people to volunteer in our ministry, and we just recruit them or ask them to attend a volunteer orientation. Because here's what we found out. If I'm talking to somebody in a courtyard trying to recruit them to become volunteer, my chance of convincing them to volunteer is very low. But if I can just get them to give up 1 hour, to come hang out in a volunteer orientation where we have an opportunity to kind of unpack the vision and show them some amazing things, we have a much higher chance of actually recruiting them to become a volunteer if they come into our turf, if we give them an opportunity. Actually, we found that about 90 to 95% of the people who attend our volunteer orientation sign up and they actually become volunteers. So instead of just recruiting volunteers, what if you can make that next step easier and invite them to attend an orientation, attend something where you have an opportunity to remove all the barriers that are in their mind, that are in their brain, that are keeping them from volunteering. So instead of recruiting, invite them to something a little easier. Okay, so that's the first hack. Second hack is this: double your potential volunteers. Now, the potential volunteers are those people who raise their hand and say, yes, I want to serve. If you could double the number of potential volunteers you have, you could almost essentially double the volunteers you actually have in your ministry. And so and this is going to sound really crazy, this is really simple. I remember years ago, we used to offer a once a month orientation for new volunteers. And we would hold it during the 10:30 service on Sunday, like on the first Sunday of the month. And what we'd always find out, we'd have like 10 people RSVP or 15 people RSVP to come to this thing, but never fail. Every single Sunday, we'd have a pretty high no-show rate. We'd have like, anywhere between 30 to 50% of people not show up to it. And oftentimes it was like a kid got sick, they got sick, something else came up, they couldn't come for whatever reason. And then the next orientation was a month away. So we had to wait like a whole month for those people to come the next time. And then oftentimes they would RSVP to come in a month, but then something would come up, they couldn't come then. And it just took too long. And so I sat down with my team and said, what if we were to do this orientation twice a month? What if we did it on the first and third Sunday of every month? And the assumption was that, well, if we have like 10 to 15 people who show up for once a month orientation, then maybe we'd have, 7 to 10 people come to each one. So like maybe we're recruiting the same number of volunteers. Here's what happened. When we transitioned, we typically ran between 7 to 10 volunteers once a month. As soon as we moved to twice a month, we still had 7 to 10 potential volunteers show up for orientation. Like, it's this math thing. I don't understand why it works or how it works, but for whatever reason, you have more opportunities for people to come and step through your process. So simply doubling the number of opportunities that we have for volunteers to actually come through our process and become new volunteers, we doubled the number of people who actually became volunteers. So I'd encourage you in this hack of just offer your orientation more often. The more often you offer it, the more opportunities you give for people to step into a role to volunteer. Sometimes the infrequency of our orientations actually prevents people from actually becoming volunteers. Okay, so that's hack number 2. Hack number 3 is this one, is host a voluntour. See what I did there? A voluntour. I think there may be all kinds of different ways that you can do a volunteer orientation. We've done things where you set up a room and you have tables and we show like really cool video. We show them curriculum, like we kind of walk through this process. But there's something really powerful by asking everyone to stand up. Let's walk over and actually look at our preschool department. Let's actually walk into the classroom and watch small group leaders leading kids in a small group. Let's walk into our student ministry area and actually watch a little bit of worship, watch a little bit of teaching. There's something really powerful about a tour. Because here's the thing. People experience and learn things in different ways. Some people are very experiential. They need to get up and walk around. They don't want to just sit and listen to a talking head for 30 minutes or 45 minutes. Pulling off a really engaging orientation once a month or twice a month, that's really hard to do. To make it something that's engaging, that keeps people off their phone and paying attention. But a tour it's inviting. When you go to visit somebody that you haven't ever visited before, what's usually the first thing they do when you go to their house? They take you on a tour. There's something really comforting and inviting about that. And you have an opportunity to move people through your environments and actually see, because here's actually what I think happens for a lot of people. Some people are nervous about volunteering. They still have all these questions. And if you can actually take them to a place where they can see it and they can see what's going on, it actually relieves the tension and makes it far easier for them to say yes. Because here's actually 2 things that I think volunteer tours do. A tour gives potential volunteers an opportunity to see what ministry actually looks like. Because they got questions like, how long do I have to teach the kids for? How long do I have to do this? What do I wear? Like all these things. And if you take them on tour, you give them a chance to actually see what serving actually looks like. The second thing that tours do, it gives volunteers an opportunity to imagine themselves serving in that ministry area. We have people all the time who say, I'm going to work with elementary age kids. And as we walk through a tour and we go through all the environments, they say, you know what? I think I want to do preschool because I could better see myself leading a group of preschoolers than third graders. And so volunteer tours actually give you an opportunity to do those kinds of things. So those are some of my 3 favorite hacks that I do unpack in my volunteer pipeline course, things that you could maybe tweak to your existing process. Now, if you're looking for more information about how you can build out, what do you need to do on that tour? What do you need to say on that tour? How do you get people signed up for your volunteer orientation? Those things, we unpack all that kind of stuff in the course, and I'd love to have you in there. But thank you so much. Hopefully your onboarding process can become better. You can recruit more people and get more people placed in your ministry through an effective strategy there.
All right, Kenny, let's talk a little bit more about volunteer orientation. And we got lots of questions we weren't able to get in the live session of Volunteer Boot Camp. But let's start here and back it up a little bit. What is like an orientation approach to onboarding volunteers versus maybe some other approaches that we're used to?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is a slightly different process. A lot of people do orientations, and I'll take a step back, because I know that for years, anytime we would do like a mass recruiting for volunteers and we had a lot of people that we needed to bring into our ministry, we would host orientations. So if we did a big announcement from the stage for a couple of weeks, we would host multiple orientations just so that way we could bring people on faster, more efficiently. But oftentimes we didn't necessarily feel the need for an orientation, because an orientation kind of felt like a big hurrah, like a big event. And so usually what I've seen is in most ministries, it kind of the onboarding process for volunteers feels more like Lord of the Flies. It's different staff members doing whatever it takes to get volunteers in their ministry as quickly as possible. And so sometimes there's not a consistent standard for how to onboard a volunteer, or how long they should take, or what steps. And if there's not an alignment around a team, then it could be that some ministry areas are bringing people onto their team with little to no training and preparation. Other ones, maybe they're even doing too much; they're making it too difficult. So an orientation style approach to onboarding volunteers helps you align across the board, because we do an orientation at my church for anywhere in children's or youth ministry. I know some churches that have taken the volunteer pipeline course, and they've actually created one orientation for all ministry areas. So from adults, check-in, greeters, hospitality, tech, whatever it may be. And they said, we want one centralized process. And it allows you to have a very consistent process, and you know that every single volunteer that comes in is going to go through the same process, or they're going to get the same kind of exposure, the same kind of list of expectations, and the same training, and all those different things. So I think what I found is that the onboarding style approach, it brings stability and structure and consistency to your onboarding process, because and I kind of talk about this in my course, the volunteer pipeline, that when orientations don't happen often enough, then people just do whatever they need to do to make it happen, and then you get to the inconsistencies again. So the volunteer onboarding process through an orientation just brings consistency and thoroughness across the board to your ministry.
Now, one of the questions that was asked, probably in response to your second hack, which I'm not going to give away, people have to listen to see what that is, but they were wondering, especially if they're a smaller church, would you do an orientation if it's just one or two people showing up? Like, that could be the concern, is that, yeah, we'll host an orientation. If we host lots of them, what if it's just really small and one or two people show up? What do you do then?
Well, it really kind of comes down to ask a bigger question, is what is a volunteer worth to you? It's kind of funny. I remember many years ago, my team, when I was in Texas, we did this giant volunteer recruitment, and we actually spent $1,000 on print materials. And we were hoping, man, we're going to recruit 50, 100 new volunteers or whatever. And this is embarrassing, but by the time it was all said and done, we recruited one volunteer. And so for the next couple of years, we called them the $1,000 volunteer. And she was an amazing volunteer. And I wouldn't necessarily say it felt like a failure. We tried something and it didn't work. And but I think that volunteers are worth it. And so if I have an opportunity to sit with a volunteer and really do it right and bring them on, and I believe bring them on in a process, in a way that I'm going to keep them for multiple years, an orientation for one volunteer is worth it to me. Now, but that's a really good question, because that doesn't address the assumption of what is a volunteer orientation, which in the recording that we did for Volunteer Boot Camp, I actually talk about a different approach to an orientation that's not, because a lot of times when you think of an orientation, you think of a big hurrah. You think of almost a small production and setting up a room and doing all those things. That's not how I do orientations. I do orientations twice a month, and they're easy to pull off, and they're very interactive and engaging. And I'll do it for one person, and I'll do it for 20 people. It doesn't matter how many people come, it's still a great experience. The less people come, the more effective that experience is because it just becomes more personal. So, and when what we found is about 95% of the people who actually come to our volunteer orientation actually become volunteers. So for me, it's worth the 45 minutes to an hour of walking them through the orientation if I'm going to get a volunteer for the next several years out of it.
Yeah, it's not $1,000, so it's like
no, it's not $1,000.
Did anybody ever tell her she's the $1,000 volunteer? She still has no idea.
No, we didn't, and we tracked for years. And now I actually eventually left that church to move here to Arizona. And but let me tell you, sometimes it pops up in my head. I was like, I wonder if she's still serving. How many years? Because the question is like, how many years? All of a sudden makes that $1,000 totally worth it.
That's awesome. So another question that came up was, would you consider an online orientation? And then there was some discussion in the chat too. People were talking about, because we didn't get to hit that, so I'd love to get your thoughts on it here. But people were talking about, well, the personal relational element would be missing. So what are your thoughts on that?
I love technology. I have fully moved to the idea that one of the best ways you can train your volunteers is to do online training or offer online training. And I don't know that this is me being old fashioned, but I don't love the idea of an online orientation. Because the reality is my orientation, I do it during one of our service times. So it's actually during a service. We've created a space, and I talk about in the volunteer pipeline, I talk about how to choose a space, even if you have no space. There are places where you can do this volunteer orientation, and I like to do it during a service because I like for people to see our ministry when we do that. And I just feel like an online volunteer orientation. This is the thing, and this is one of the things that I talk about in the recording a little bit about making it easier for the potential volunteer to say yes. And I think that when I have a potential volunteer in my environment, a place that I designed and created for them to showcase what serving looks like, to show them all the benefits and the wonder of what it looks like to be a volunteer, we make it really easy for someone to say yes. And there's just something about doing a volunteer orientation that's online. It's just too easy to say no to that. It's too easy to ignore that. Like, I'd rather be looking someone in the eyes and say, so what do you think? Like, of all the areas we just saw and all the things we just talked about, where do you want to serve? And it's just too easy for them to get caught up in the excitement of it and say, absolutely, yes, I want to serve in preschool or I want to serve here. But if it just feels too distant to me. I mean, I'd maybe be open to considering, but here's the thing. If it doesn't work for their schedule, then they're going to have a hard time volunteering. Because I do my orientation on Sunday mornings. So I would just say, hey, if now's not a good time, we do orientations twice a month. Come, I'll put you on the list. We'll call you in 2 months. We'll get you plugged in there. I don't understand the point of an online volunteer orientation if you're doing orientations on the weekend, which I really propose and push very strongly for a specific type of volunteer orientation that happens during one of the services.
Yeah. One of the questions that was asked is what positions are offered to people. And I'll expand this too. Like, do you offer every volunteer position through orientations and tours, or are there certain ones you wait till later, or it's a personal invite or something like that?
I've learned over the years, I've been doing this for 22 years now. So I've learned what seems to work, what seems to be frustrating. And there was a time when our sign-up card for serving in children's ministry, youth ministry, looked like a census form, where you had, 100 different bubbles that people could check mark. And what I found was it was usually just a waste of time, that it was basically you would have a certain percentage of people that would literally check box every single bubble you had options for. And so over the years, and then if your youth ministry and children's ministry are not aligned, then you have 20 different jobs that they could do in preschool and 20 different jobs that they can do in student ministry. And I felt like it got confusing. So we only have on our sign up form, our interest form, we only have, I think it's 6 positions that they can sign up for. And they're the same 6 positions for youth ministry as there are for children's ministry. And so we make it really simple. And the honest truth is, as we walk through the process, we tell them about, 80% of our volunteers are small group leaders. So my assumption is that 80% of the people in that room are probably going to sign up to be small group leaders, either small group leaders. And I think there's something valuable when you do an aligned team, like a lot of an aligned volunteer onboarding process is that, again, it's kind of that reference back to the Lord of the Flies experience, is that I don't recruit to youth ministry and I don't recruit to children's ministry. I recruit to a small group leader. I recruit to large group leader because I want to find what people are passionate about first and where their gift set lies. And then what age group they serve in is usually a secondary question. And I think the same thing's true of adults as well. So when it comes to check-in or greeting, hospitality, tech booth, or those things, like I don't want to first find people who are interested in working with kids and then find out if they can work a tech booth. I want to find people who are really interested in working in a tech booth, and then say we got opportunities in both kids and junior high to do that. So we kind of narrowed the focus on and kind of limited it down to just 5 to 6. And actually one of the check boxes we have on there is we call it Kid Community. It's our leadership room, is where kids who are there for 2 services go. So that's like one of our check marks. We have, kind of it's like a support roles on there as well. So people come in during the week to prep classrooms and things like that. So if you take out those things, like we really only have about 4 options for people to choose. And I think it's served us really well. That when you have too many options, it just makes it too complicated, I think. So
yeah, choice overload and all that stuff. Well, let's shift gears and talk a little about the recording that we let people listen to, and hopefully they'll go listen to the whole thing. But you do tours for voluntours, as you call them. So just to recap real quick, in case they haven't listened to it, what's a voluntour?
So I think that's the secret sauce, because when we first started doing orientations 10 years ago at my last church, we would make them big productions. We worked really hard to make it a big deal that people got a lot of energy out of, but it took up my whole staff to pull it off. Like we had a host, we had a game, we had some stories, we introduced different areas, and it became this big production. And so we could only do it a few times a year because it was a lot of work. And I think this was kind of born out of a necessity of we were trying to pull something off really quickly, that I had a handful of volunteers who were interested in serving. And I just, we didn't have the time to put together an orientation. So I just reached out to them and said, hey, why don't you guys meet me at 10 o'clock in the kids check-in area. And we'll talk about ministry, and we'll walk around, we'll look at different areas. And that was kind of where the voluntour was born, was where it just kind of was a very natural thing. And I've just found that over the years that tours are really effective. There's so many reasons why somebody wants to say no to serving in your ministry, whether it's a time commitment, maybe they feel like it's going to be too much. They're probably replaying experiences that they had when they were a kid, or maybe how they served at a previous church. And so they already are leaning towards no before they've even seen what you have to offer. And so I think a voluntour does a couple things really powerfully. It actually shows them what your ministry looks like, so they get a chance to see it in action. But then it also gives them an opportunity to imagine themselves in that role. They can see themselves sitting on the floor in that circle with that group of preschoolers or junior hires, and it helps them imagine that. So I think there's something about, when you go visit a family member that you haven't seen in years and they've moved to a new house, the first thing you do when you get to their house is they take you on a tour. There's something very inviting about that. And tours are really easy to pull off. Like once you've done it twice, it's you know what rooms you hit at what times, you know what stories you want to tell at what spaces, and what coaches and staff you want to introduce them to. So it becomes really easy to pull off. So it's a really easy way to do an orientation twice a month. And whether it's 3 people or 30 people, and it's really effective. It's very interactive. If you got people who are auditory learners, and you got other people that are more visual, you got other people that are bodily kinesthetic, like a tour really kind of hits all the different approaches to how people learn and pay attention. So I think it's worth doing. You just really need a starting point and ending point. So we have Volunteer Central, a great place for volunteers where we have food, and we've got some compelling things on the wall, things like that. But you could start this off at like in a lobby. You could start it off in your kids' check-in area. You just have to just start it like 5 minutes after church starts, so when things slow down. So it's really easy to pull off. And in the volunteer pipeline course, I spend 2 weeks in that course, or 2 sessions of that course, really kind of walking through how to build a tour that is irresistible. That's just easy for people to say yes to volunteering after you do that. And so we found a lot of success with it. Ultimately, the numbers speak for themselves. 95% of the people who come through our volunteer become volunteers. So we know then the win for us is just getting people to sign up for a volunteer orientation. If they come to orientation, we know they're going to become a volunteer. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. Now, this is kind of like the question about the orientation too. Would you consider like a video volunteer? Now, again, you're going to miss some of the parts of that you mentioned where you're in person and it's relational and all this stuff. But would you consider, could a church consider doing some kind of a video tour to let people see what it's like?
I think so. I think you could probably get. I'd have to work through that, because like even if you. I'd want a question to know why. Like the things that I would consider showing videos for would be things that maybe they wouldn't see on the tour. So like it may be showing a baptism story, where somebody, there's a really compelling story of a kid talking about the impact that our small group leader made or their experience at camp. Maybe showing a quick video about some of the events that we do during the year in the different ministry areas, like camps and baptisms and child dedications. Like I would show those kinds of things. Show, because it is like, even when we go on the tour, I talk about this in the course that I cast vision around our problem areas, because every ministry has their problem areas. Like, you've got an environment that maybe doesn't quite have enough volunteers. And so I don't avoid it. They're going to see it. And so I cast vision for, hey, some of you guys are here because you're going to help us build this ministry to become what it needs to become. But I take them through my favorite spots too. Like when we go through the 2-year-old classrooms, we have 3 2-year-old environments, and I walk through one of them. And so I'll ask my preschool coordinator, hey, which 2-year-old room should I walk through this morning? Because I don't want to walk through the apocalypse one. I want to walk through the one where the kids aren't struggling as much. And so we want to show up those best spots. So I would say use video if it helps you show something that they're not going to see on your tour, or something that's really going to sell them. Because like if your church has a really slick video about camp or about a mission trip or something like that they would get to do because they're a volunteer, then absolutely show it. But I wouldn't. If I can, I'd still want to walk through. I would want to show people the environments, and I know people ask this question too about background checks and things like that. They're on a tour. There's only, there's usually for us, and we're a fairly large church. For us, we do them twice a month, and we typically have anywhere between 5 and 10, 7 to 12 people on that tour. So it's not too many to keep track of. You can put a lanyard on them that says like, potential volunteer or volunteer recruit or whatever you want to do. And I don't background check my people coming on the tour because they're with me. They're not sitting down. They're not interacting with kids. They're not touching kids. They're not talking to kids. They're walking through. But then a week or two later, when those people are sitting in circles observing, then they'll be background checked by then.
Now, with your tours, how long does it take? And it's coupled as, part of the orientation, right? So like, how long does the tour itself take?
Well, and it's not just coupled with the orientation. It really is the orientation. So I take about, we usually start the orientation about 5 minutes after service starts. Because people start coming, especially if they come to our first service. We've got a 30-minute gap between the 2 services, between our first and second service. So people oftentimes come to our 9 o'clock, and then at 10:05, they come to the volunteer orientation room or volunteer central, and they may sit there and wait for 20 minutes. Now we have all our volunteers coming in and grabbing coffee and sodas and donuts. And so we have that intentionally to where it's a kind of fun, active environment where they don't feel like they're just sitting in a room by themselves. But we start about 5 minutes after service starts, and we spend about maybe 5 to 10 minutes beforehand, introducing ourselves, let everyone introduce themselves, maybe talk about what area they're interested in serving in. And then we take them on the tour, and the tour probably lasts 30 to 40 minutes. And it probably would depend. Like at my church, we're in Arizona. So we typically don't have like one building. Everything's like our lobby is the outdoors. Like I even have buildings here that don't have bathrooms in them. So like, people have to leave the building that they're in to go to another building where there's a bathroom, which is just kind of an Arizona thing. But so depending on the size of your church and the amount of spaces you have to go to, it could take 20 minutes, it could take 40 minutes. And but then when we come back, I usually wrap up with a couple questions, which usually there aren't very many questions. And then that's when they start to fill out their interest form and begin the process of filling out their application. And so by the time it's from start to finish, if they stay there and fill out their application as well, it may be the entire hour. So it may be the entire service time. But some people may dart out of there, in 40 minutes. Like maybe they've already filled out an application or they're going to do it online later. They can be out of there in 40 minutes.
Now, some of this with the orientation, with even the tour and all that kind of stuff, it's the early part of onboarding. It can be looked at as the later part of recruiting, like you even talk about,
right.
If people go back and listen to it, how this is a different way, to think about even recruiting. So in terms of how this works and where it falls in that between recruiting and onboarding, what is onboarding? Why do you think it is important, like the way it is there? And then what does onboarding look like after this? Because there's still lots of other steps to onboard a volunteer. Tell us, one, why you like it this way. I think there could be confusion. I know one of the questions during the call was, this sounds a little bit like recruiting, sounds really helpful, but
right.
It doesn't sound as much like onboarding. Speak to that, but then tell us a little bit about onboarding after this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I do see recruiting as something very different as recruiting. And you talk a lot about this in your 8 to 10 week course of Volunteer Playbook. And you spend a lot of time talking about, finding volunteers to ask and to invite to those things. And so, I see this as maybe the latter part of recruiting in the sense, and I talk about this in the recording for this, for the volunteer, boot camp, as well as in the course, that when we recruit people from whatever method we use, whether it's in the bulletin, whether somebody makes an announcement, or whether somebody just fills out a form on your website, I kind of equate that to people raising their hand saying, I want to volunteer. And I talk about this ratio of this percentage of people who don't actually become volunteers. It's a volunteer conversion rate. And I found at one of the churches I served at in Texas was that our church had a 30% a volunteer conversion rate. That of the, if 10 people raise their hand, only about 3.5% of those, or 3.5 of those volunteers would actually become volunteers. And that was, and depending on what event we did, like if it was an ask from the stage, it was definitely on the lower end. If we did a personal invite, it was definitely on the higher end. And so I feel like the volunteer onboarding process is one of the most important ways that you can increase your volunteer conversion rate. So call it recruiting. It's a secondary part of recruiting. I think oftentimes if all of us were to be honest, some of the reason why people didn't say yes is because our systems were broken. We forgot to email them back. We wrote them down on a piece of paper and we lost that piece of paper, or, whatever it may be. And if you don't have a good process, like whether you call it recruiting or onboarding, like we didn't finish the job of getting them there. So that's kind of part of this whole pipeline that I created, was to make sure that the volunteers don't fall through the cracks, that you have a system that once somebody raises their hand, they're in a system that is almost impossible for them to get lost or forgotten. And then, but the same thing, because in the beginning of the volunteer pipeline, we're working so hard to get them to come to an orientation, because that's the secret sauce. If I can get them to come to an orientation, then I know that I'm going to get them as a volunteer. So we've created all kinds of different steps and processes that help move them, and accounting for every possible action they might have. They might no-show. They might forget. They may say, I'm not interested now. And so you have to have a response for every single one of those expected actions that a potential volunteer takes. And that's what the volunteer pipeline is about. Now, on the second side of the orientation, it's not about driving them to this thing that's going to recruit them. Now it's just, how can we quickly place them as a long-term volunteer in a way that we know that safety is prioritized, and that they're prepared and those things. So in the same way that we've created boxes and steps and processes to get them to an orientation, we've created boxes and steps and processes to bring them on as volunteers, because the faster you can get them in their role, the happier they're going to be, the more excited they're going to be, the more equipped they're going to be, as long as you take them through the process. So in the volunteer pipeline, I kind of outlined about 6 or 7 steps that need to be completed in order, and those are like really simple, like, they got to be background checked, they got to have references checked, they've got to have an interview, they need an observation, they need training. And so how do you create a systematized process that before we give them their shirt and their lanyard and say, here's your curriculum or here's your group of kids, that they've actually done everything that they need to do? I've done a lot of research on this over the last year and a half since launching this course. And most people, like it's significant, like 80% or more people say that their volunteer onboarding process is terrible. They're not happy with it. But a lot of people don't have a plan to make it better. And so that's kind of, I feel like the onboarding is both of those pieces, helping people get from when they say, yes, I want to volunteer, to all the way becoming volunteers. You have to look at both sides. It's a latter part of recruiting, and then it's the actually onboarding them into a volunteer role. And if we're not efficient and effective with it, then you're going to be working a lot harder than you have to. And you're going to have volunteers that maybe don't stick around as long as you can, because the better you do it, the longer they're going to stay on your team and more excited they're going to be and prepared they're going to be to actually lead your ministry.
All right, last question. How do you advertise your orientations tours? How do people find out about them?
A million different ways. And this is kind of recruiting too. We've created a lot of different ways. We've got places on our campus where we have posters up to say, interested in joining the Next Gen team, text, and we have a text number to where they just do an auto response and click it, and it sends them an RSVP. Our website has, if you're interested in serving in Next Gen, they fill out that form. And when they fill out that form, they're actually choosing what orientation they want to go to. We actually even have a step and process that if somebody comes up to me on a Sunday and says, hey, I'm interested in signing up for volunteering, then I have a process on my phone that right then and there I can say, okay, let me put in your name, your number, your email address, and then hit submit. And then they're automatically in a queue, in a process queue. We use CCB, but they're in our volunteer pipeline that now they're going to get a weekly text and email until they actually show up for an orientation. So we've kind of created a lot of different ways, even for like volunteers who are currently volunteering. We give them the right tool to make it really easy. If they're talking to somebody who's interested in serving, we don't make it like, well, just send Kenny an email, or just, we like right then and there. Nope, text this code word to this number, and then you're in the process. And so we just make it really easy for people. So what we're a church of about 4,000 people. And so there's a drip. So we don't actually oftentimes find that we're working super hard intentionally to recruit people to come to orientation. We just have this constant drip because there are places all over campus and on our website and in different places where it's just easy for people to find this. And so we have this constant drip of people who are saying, so like right now, if I were to look at my process queue for our volunteer pipeline, we've got about 40 people in it. Now, there's only probably about 5 or 6 people that are currently RSVP'd for the next orientation, but there's a bunch of people who no-showed for the last 2 or 3. There's other people that had expressed interest, but they haven't yet RSVP'd. And so we have specific emails and text that are going out on about a 10-day basis to all those different groups of people, constantly pushing them to the next orientation. So it's just kind of like, it's a drip. And that's how we just made it consistent. And also, I think we do orientations on the second and fourth Sunday of every month. So it's just consistent. The only times that we don't is when Christmas or Easter falls on one of those Sundays. Every other Sunday, second and fourth Sunday, so it's consistent. So if people miss it, like even if on our emails, we constantly, like if somebody's supposed to serve, come to an orientation, but then they email us that they can't, we automatically send them the link. Okay, go ahead and sign up for the next one. So we advertise, it's everywhere. So if you're interested in serving, it's not going to be hard for you to find, but the step that we send them to is to RSVP for an orientation, not get more information, not talk to somebody. It's just like the orientation is the answer to every question about possibly volunteering in Next Gen. And that's what I think makes it successful, is that it is the first step, and it's the only first step, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. It reminds me of like our, we've done this for a while, but in the last year we kind of changed how we, onboard people, not onboard people, but like assimilate people into the church. What are the next steps? What's the path? And one of the phrases we adopted was like, all roads lead to New Here, because New Here is where we want everybody to get to, no matter how you came to the church. Sounds like that's like your volunteer orientation, like all roads lead to volunteer orientation, which is smart. Cool.
It is. And we've created a new thing here too that we're really excited about called the Thrive Experience, which is kind of it's a 4-week experience for people who are new to our church and since we just launched it, we're really encouraging everybody to come. But a big driving force out of that is to volunteer. So we're kind of pushing a lot of people toward those things of, come to Thrive Experience, because we know if they come to Thrive Experience, there's a good chance they're going to show up for volunteer orientation after that's done. But it really is. And even as I talk to new families who come, I say, a really great way to get connected to a church is to serve. And if you're interested in what that might look like, you can just, sign up here to come to a volunteer orientation. So it really is in the same way as all roads lead to this one destination.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing in the volunteer boot camp session, which if people haven't listened to, they should go back and listen to. They should also check out the volunteer pipeline course, because one of my favorite thing about our courses with Ministry Boost isn't just the teaching on the video that you get, it's all the resources, and the pipeline course is as packed with resources as any course we have. If you just want to like copy Kenny's systems and documents and processes and tweak them for yourself and then put them in there, they can do that for sure. So Kenny, thanks for coming back on, answering these questions we weren't able to get to. And it was really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Well, hopefully you listened to the last episode with Nina talking about recruiting, and then with this episode and Kenny talking about onboarding. These two things, these are the two most important things if you're going to grow your volunteer base, because a good onboarding system, as Kenny talked about, can actually help you recruit. And certainly once people have said yes, it raises the odds that they're going to actually end up serving. So here are a few action items I think of coming out of that episode. One would be to get Kenny's volunteer pipeline course. That is one of our most popular. In fact, it might be the most popular Ministry Boost course. It is also the course, I think, that has the most resources packed into it. So documents, files, systems, checklists, processes, that kind of thing. So if you want to, overhaul and improve your volunteer onboarding process, there's lots of stuff that you can kind of copy, edit, and use from the course. And you can get that at ministryboost.org. The other thing I think of is start a monthly orientation, like Kenny does. And the third thing is right along with it, hold a volunteer tour, let people see, the environments. Maybe this will be specific to your ministry. Maybe it'll be for the whole church, but these are some things you can start right away and see if you can see some improvement in volunteer recruiting and retaining those who, raise their hand and say they want to volunteer. You can get all the links and notes and all that, especially a link to Volunteer Bootcamp replay if you didn't watch it yet at nickblevins.com/episode 172. But I hope this has been helpful. Certainly, leading volunteers is, for most people listening, probably the most important thing they do. And so I hope this whole series is helpful with that, the boot camp stuff, these Q&As, getting the questions we didn't get to. I hope all of this helps you lead volunteers better. So go for it. Put some of this stuff into action. Lead volunteers better this week. And I'll catch you on the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.